So after much coercion and thought about, how do I do this? And it's a learning process. Everything's a learning process. But I thought it would be really cool to try to put together a small tutorial of sorts to talk a little bit about one of the things that I've been very fascinated lately, which is agentic AI and kind of how, with agents themselves specifically, you could sort of build out these very complex workflows and make it really easy for yourself. Like, especially when you're a beginner and you'd have no knowledge on how to code, you have no knowledge on anything AI related, and you're just like, I want to kind of like dive in and try something really cool. One of the key things that I discovered recently was that you could use these AI enabled IDEs, which are like development environments, to build out certain things. So you could build out an application, you could build out a web app, you could build out all kinds of things. And I thought it'd be really cool to try to look into that a little bit. I found this amazing, kind of informative YouTube tutorial online, which I'll link to below, which really helped me wrap my mind around how this works. And I thought it would be cool to kind of give my interpretation of what's going on there. Also, from a design standpoint, kind of fixating on how design actually works in the context of all of this. Because for me as a designer, I'm still learning and I'm still growing from the fact that AI is developing around me, and I need to figure out how can I incorporate this in my workflow. So I wanted to tackle this kind of more from a designer standpoint, not necessarily from a developer standpoint, and just look at what can you do, like what can you actually accomplish as a designer in this day and age, and what can you accomplish as a layperson, even someone who doesn't necessarily actually have any background in tech. So hopefully parts of this tutorial will be kind of informative and you'll get a sense of what you could do. I'll kind of walk through the demo of what I built out, and I kind of really used a lot of the same examples that they used in this inspirational YouTube tutorial, which I'll again link to below. But I took elements of it and then kind of like also put some of my design thinking and some of my process of thinking into it. So with that all being said, let's give it a go and see what happens. So one of the cool things that was mentioned in that video is Cursor, which is an AI enabled development environment. There are several various kind of developer environments that you can actually like use. Visco Code or VS Studio is like amazing. You could actually use that. I don't think it would be as, I feel like for me, this was very entry level and it was great. VS Studio kind of tends to be a little bit more technical and sometimes throws me off a little bit. There are a lot of free ones also online. I can try to link to some below as well that you can take a look at. The thing that was really key for me was simplicity. And I'm always looking for something that's quick, easy to understand. And I don't have to like put a lot of my thinking into the tool. Like I want a tool that just kind of works off the bat. The entry barriers are very low and I can just start playing around with it. So this one in particular, Cursor, is great. Like I think it's fairly easy to understand. One of the key things you need to remember, and the only command I feel like that was like, or like, shortcut that was really useful to me was Command L, which sort of pulls out your actual chat tool, which is where you will actually chat to an AI that will help you code everything. A lot of your coding elements will appear here in the center. And here you kind of get an idea as to how your actual code project is building itself out. The thing that's really key to remember is that you're not doing a lot of the work. A lot of the work will be done by the AI. And so, making sure that the AI is running the way that you're expecting it to run, it's doing what you're expecting it to do, that's where you really have to kind of focus a lot of your thought process on, and making sure that your guidance is clear. One of the key things that I find, especially when I'm interacting with AI right now and any kind of like AI based tool, is that I need you to kind of think through the problem and explain it the way I really would explain it to maybe like a child, right? And you have to really give it that sort of sequential process of how it should think through the problem. And that's one of the key elements of agentic AI, is that you really need to give the AI the steps that it's going to take or that it should be taking in order to think through the problem, right? That's really, really important because that's kind of how it will also begin to source its responses. It's how it actually will help you troubleshoot and problem solve any issues that you might have. The key thing to remember here as well is that you're going to primarily be using what's called the composer here in this tool. And there are two different modes. So there's a normal mode and then there's an agent mode. If you select the agent mode, it means that you're going to be using an agent-based AI process. And so therefore, it's going to use that sort of step-by-step thinking in kind of coming up with your solution. The various models that you can pick from, we're primarily going to use Claude here. I find Claude to be the best one. It's also the one that the initial YouTuber suggested. But again, you could use any of the models that are available here. Your results may vary. I would say, you know what, really don't hone in on just one. Like start with one, but really play around with it. Specifically for this one, and what we're going to do in the next little while, we're going to be using Claude. So with that said, we're now going to try to begin the process of actually looking into how we can start up and kind of prime our model to start the process of what it's going to be doing, basically how it's going to be tackling this project. So now basically you get to some of the more exciting part. And so you're going to get to see a little bit of what the AI is going to do in terms of its work. To start it off, I'm giving it a initial prompt. And so a prompt is basically just your way of talking to the AI. The interesting thing is that, again, you have to be sequential in what it is you want to do. Talk to it like you're talking to someone that obviously is much younger than you. So, use as many explainers as possible. And so to prime it for the project that we're going to be doing, it's always good to kind of source kind of some sort of reference that maybe, you're inspired by. So in this case, because that demo talked a lot about using Twilio and Voiceflow and sort of building a hybrid tool of those, which is what this demo is going to create at the end. Again, I've just referenced exactly the same, right? So your task is to build a full stack web app that is a combination of Twilio and Voiceflow. That way it knows where to actually source kind of its basic files from. It's going to pull developer kits from both of those applications because those developer kits will exist on the internet. So anything that exists on the internet, that kind of is given as a developer tool can be sourced by this AI. And then it actually uses that to sort of build out what you'll eventually see in the interface, right? And so we're going to start off by creating a Next.js project. That's just the type of project that we're going to be creating here specifically. There are various different project types. Obviously, YouTube, your friend, Google, you'll discover all the different project types that exist. And then again, at the bottom here, I've given it instructions in terms of how it should behave. So I don't want it to just create a mass of files that maybe eventually will be difficult to sort of parse through. We're wanting it to be as mindful and as efficient as possible. And so with that in mind, we set it up. So we submit our request. And what it's going to do now is it's going to actually tell you what it's going to do. It's going to actually say to you, I'll help you create a streamlined Next.js project that integrates Twilio and Voiceflow. So let's start off by setting up the Next.js project with the minimal necessary files. So first it's going to ask you what it wants to do. So what it's doing now is as it's going to be installing every kind of dependency that it wants to use for it to work, it's going to ask you, do you want to actually do this? And this is really your intervention in a lot of this. I think that this goes back to that point that, AI is going to be so easy to replace humans. It doesn't necessarily need humans to accomplish things. No, it does. Like you still need to be the overseer of what it's doing. It's literally just removing a lot of that menial work for you. So a lot of what will happen here is something that maybe it would have taken a developer some time to kind of go and kind of like source through the internet and kind of pull together, or kind of source whatever they have locally saved on their hard drives. It's going to do exactly that. It's just going to do it a lot quicker. So we're going to start running it. And so first it's going to tell you different things, right? Like it's going to ask you things like, oh, I noticed that NPX is not installed. I don't have NPX installed on my computer right now. That's a dependency that it needs. So it's going to ask you, let's install Node.js with NPM. So that means that my very layman's computer doesn't have, Node.js. This is not my work computer. This is my home computer. So I don't have it installed on there. So now it's going to actually ask you, Homebrew is not installed. It's literally going to start to identify everything that's not available. But this is really key for you as a first-time user because you obviously, when you're starting off and you're not a developer, you aren't going to know to actually have all these things in place. And so what I found really interesting when I saw all of this go down was, you know what? This actually is almost like a step-by-step tutorial on how to get started as a developer. And it really prompted me to actually go and think back to everything that I did initially when I first set up my work computer to do everything that it does now. This was kind of like, oh, this would have been really useful because I think I relied on a outliner that was given to me internally, like at work, to actually do all of that. Whereas here, like I literally have the AI telling me what needs to happen. And so now it's actually going to start to install Homebrew first, then it will install NPX, and then it will create the Next.js project. And that sequential step of, series of events is really cool. Like you literally, I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to Google a tutorial on how to do this. The tutorial is here, inbuilt, embedded, and ready to go. So we're going to give it a few minutes and then we're going to see what it's going to do when it actually does install. And once it starts to produce the Next.js projects, I'll continue the recording from there. So I kind of skipped over a little bit of its installation process, but basically all it did was it downloaded Homebrew. It got me to give it access to my computer to install Homebrew, and then it installed Next.js. Sorry, Node.js. And now what it's going to start to do is actually create the Next.js project using those dependencies already having been installed. And that's where I thought it would be cool for you to now see what it's going to do. So as you can see, it's telling me now that we have Node.js installed, let's create the new Next.js project. And so if I run the command, it's going to actually ask me a couple of questions around some of the customizations that I might be looking for. Typically, most of the time, you don't need to do anything with regards to customization. You can always query your customizations or what it's asking you to do. So there's a great tool called DEnigma, which I will also link to in this. And DEnigma actually allows you to basically paste any line of code, and it gives you an indication of what you actually are looking at in very plain English, right? And so you could actually just paste or copy paste all of this in there, and it would actually tell you straight up what it is, you are looking at, and kind of really give it to you in a very like simple, straightforward explanation. So now that it's actually like, I've given it access to what it needs to get access to, it's asked me, I see we need to create a new directory for our project. Let's create one and navigate to it, right? So it's going to create a directory for me, and that means that on my local drive, it's creating a directory locally for me to actually like store all my files and have everything set up for me, right? And that's really neat. Like I'm literally like, what work am I doing here? None. I'm literally just acknowledging a lot of cool things that it's asking me to do, and we're just going for it. So now it's going to create the Next.js project in this directory, and that means that it's basically going to ask me now a bunch of questions around this. Like would I like to use TurboPack? No, I wouldn't. Again, anything that you are, you have questions about, I ask those questions online to Enigma. I get the answers that I need. So, literally look around online for those responses, or you can actually prompt it directly. So you could actually ask it, do I actually need this, right? And you could just go in here and actually like in the chat itself, which is the other window, literally ask it any of those questions. Like drop in your lines of code here, ask it to explain it to you. It has its own way of doing it that's a little bit different from Enigma, so you could use either or. Now you're actually going to see what it's going to do is it's going to install some of the developer kits that it got from Twilio and Voiceflow. Those are the two inspirations that we gave it. So it's pulling from the internet any of the resources that it can find from either of those two companies to kind of like be sort of the rudimentary base level set of assets from which it's now going to draw and build out your experience. Because it's doing that, we're going to say yes. Something that's really key that you should do at this point actually is go to both of those websites and whatever element it is you're trying to replicate. So in our case, we're going to replicate the editor, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with what Twilio or Voiceflow does, but basically they're communication marketing tools. A lot of those annoying texts that you typically will get on your phone typically come from one of these systems. So in order to build out the triggers for how those texts are sent out and how any kind of communication is sent out, you will use an application like Voiceflow or Twilio. So because we're using that and we're going to use the editor, which is where you actually do set up that triggering process, we can take screenshots of it and kind of use those as inspiration. And you'll see a little bit later, I'll show you how I actually like uploaded some of those as an example. So it actually has a UI reference for that as well. So those are good things to collect right now. It says, I think we're not in the correct directory. Let's navigate to the correct project directory. It's almost correcting itself, which I really love. It recognizes when there's a problem. It knows what's up. And then it's, trying to go around trying to solve for that. So it says, now let's create the essential files for our application. So first, let's create a .env file for our environment variables. Again, really just explaining everything to you as it's doing it. Super, super key. So we're going to let it install a little bit, and then I'm going to show you what the output will be once it's done. So after a few minutes, it actually did a bunch of things, right? So it actually looked for a SDK for Voiceflow. It discovered that there was an issue with that Voiceflow SDK. And then it told me that. So it said, I apologize for the confusion with the Voiceflow SDK. Let's just install Twilio. So it seemed like it was simpler for it to just install Twilio. And it actually says that it has an alternate solution for how we can actually get some of the details for Voiceflow, and it's going to use a REST API. An API is just another way of communicating with the servers. It's a survey protocol. And so right now, what it's going to actually do is it's going to now install the Twilio SDK that it discovered. It's basically done that. And now it's actually going to say, it's like literally asking me, so a bunch of things happened after it's tried to install the two different SDKs that it had found. It found out that it could not work with the Voiceflow SDK. So it actually was saying that, there are a bunch of errors that it summed up. I didn't even bother to try to try to investigate. I was just like, well, I guess it's only the errors, so it can't work. And so it actually says to you, I apologize for the confusion with the Voiceflow SDK. Let's just try to install the Twilio one for now, and we'll handle voice flow through a REST API. So it's going to use another kind of protocol to communicate with the servers to try to get some of the file data for voice flow, and that's its alternate solution to using the SDK because that SDK failed. In the meantime, it's going to install Twilio. So it ends up installing Twilio successfully, and then it actually now begins to set up the actual API. So it's literally is asking me upfront. Now I'll create a minimal but functional structure for our application. So, it's like we'll need an API to route and handle Twilio webhooks. It literally gives you a breakdown of what it's going to try to do next, right? And beyond that, it says, now let's route the API to handle Twilio webhooks and voice flow integration. So it already sees the integrations, it knows what it needs to do, and it's already trying to find ways in which to solve for this, right? Again, you're going to see that there are going to be a bunch of errors here that it actually came up with because it tried to create a simple front-end page to test the integration, and now that there are multiple issues that it's facing, right? It faced those issues. It's actually found a solution around them, and now you can see in here too, it's actually beginning to successfully build out a front end. So it says I've created a minimal but functional integration between Twilio and Voiceflow. So that was a success. It actually tells you what it's set up, the webhook, a front end page that provides instructions on how to set up and use the integration. So again, this is really key because you literally could pass this off to a developer when you do decide to build out your application, and they actually have an easy way to kind of, in layman's terms, understand what this entire AI did. It's built an environment file. It's also now going to start to ask me a bunch of questions around how to deploy the application. So it's asking me currently, like, deploy the application or run it locally with npm rdep. The application is designed to be minimal but extensible. So you can send SMS to your Twilio number, and they'll be processed by Voiceflow. So it's actually doing the work. It's actually done the work, realistically. There is a fully functioning system. So in the next round, we're actually going to try to get a little bit of a look at maybe what the UI looks like for this, because it seems like the back part of this is sort of built out. So now that it actually did all the backup setup, we're going to try to ask it to focus on the front end, and this is where it's going to come in essential to have your references. And for me, this was the part that was actually the most fun, because in many ways, I got to kind of describe what I wanted out of a UI to it. And I think that is immensely fascinating because it means, as a designer, because you will actually fully understand the extent maybe of like an interaction or the extent of what should be done correctly accessibility wise, you could actually give it as much detail as possible to try to meet those requirements, and it will kind of help prototype essentially what it is you're describing, right? And not just prototype it, in this case it's already functional. So what's really really for me cool about this is that you could literally, as a designer, come up with an entire application, right? And really prototype your application, build out UI, and then maybe work with some of your front end devs and back end devs to then go and try to execute on this, right? It's giving you that freedom, that accessibility to that end state, which for us tends to be kind of, just a very static screen most of the time, or a very complexly built Figma prototype. In this case, you actually have a fully functional coded prototype. And what I love about this is that you can then port this over in many ways. Like there's so many beginner elements to this that could be given to a front end dev that a front-end dev could then begin to utilize. So with all of that being said, we're going to give it some sort of a prompt to try to focus on the front end. So I'm going to ask it, let's build out the front end of the application, right? In terms of what I wanted to build out, I wanted to build out an editor. So I'm looking for a drag and drop editor with a white background, maybe white graph paper style background. I feel like it's going to fuck up in that part, but we'll find out if it does. White graph paper style background along with draggable tiles for the various functional elements. The tiles are housed in a sidebar because I want that to kind of to see if it will actually build out that editor interface correctly. The tiles are housed in a sidebar where the user can drag and drop them onto the canvas. I also feel like we should actually use the term canvas here. So instead of a graph paper style canvas, drag and drop editor with a graph paper styled background. Let's just use the word canvas here. Okay. And so then we're going to ask it, the tiles are housed in the sidebar, drag and drop onto the canvas. These, I'm attaching some inspiration from Twilio. Let's do else. Twilio, I cannot spell. Twilio and Voiceflow. And so here, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually add two of my images that I basically made screenshots of earlier. So I took some screenshots from Twilio, from Webflow, from Voiceflow, and I'm just going to put them in here and give it to the AI as points of reference. One thing I also should mention, and I'm going to add that in here, the tiles can be connected using basically like what are essentially like little noodles. I don't know if you've ever used something like Blender, but these little like connector noodles. So we're going to call those, can be connected using, well, let's just call them connector noodles. Connection points that extend. They're actually I feel like they're called, they have a name. I know they have a name. So we're going to look that up in the meantime. But either way, we're going to give it this and we're going to see what it's going to do. And now you can see it's processing. So it's going to tell me, I'll have to create a drag and drop flow editor similar to Voiceflow and Twilio's interfaces. We'll use React Flow, which is perfect for this kind of interactive. See, and that's what I love about it. Like, it's actually justifying what it's doing, why it picked a tool, why it went there, And again, now it's installing the dependency. So again, I don't have to look for any dependencies right now. It's literally going and doing that work of scouring the internet to try to find exactly what it needs to accomplish this task. And that's just phenomenal. Like, as someone who doesn't actively write code on a daily basis, this makes it, I don't know, the barriers to entry are non-existent here. So it's going to now basically build out the components. And then once it's done, we'll resume and come back to this. As with anything that you're going to be building, especially when it comes to, you not necessarily being maybe the most tech savvy, there's a lot of trial and error that needs to happen. And so there was a lot of troubleshooting that I actually had to do. But what I loved about the troubleshooting here is that I just had to keep asking it, what is wrong? And I kept asking it what is wrong or how could this be done differently? And it kept coming back with answers where it tried to improve itself and tried to do better each and every single time. And what's fascinating is that even after all of that, it corrected all of its errors. It produced what it was going to actually show me. And when I finally wanted to actually test out the UI, I was pleasantly surprised because what we end up getting at the end is actually kind of insane. So what you've got here now is the UI that it produced. So this maybe took me about 15 minutes in total to do with even that troubleshooting in there. But it's got this very basic rudimentary drag and drop structure, right? And though the tiles don't sit on the screen yet, it's done almost everything else. It's created a graph based editor, it's got the tiles, it's got, given me a toolbar. We can even make changes. So, for example, I can actually ask it to up the color of some of the text-based elements. So, make all text on screen, let's say black, and what it'll end up doing is it'll try to make an update of this UI to actually like make all these text elements black. But from a style guide standpoint, for example, you would need to do a little bit more work to make sure that there is that consistency and that there is that hierarchy in the structure. It's also got the zoom functionality, which I thought was really, really neat. It has a full screen functionality, which I think you can't really see from a shared screen experience, but believe me, it works. You can also lock the canvas, which I thought was really, really neat. I think it picked a lot of these up from the UI that I had referenced as well. Going forward, what I'm going to try to do now is try to refine what it's got here so far. Maybe even get it to actually preserve the tiles on the canvas. But again, I did not do any coding whatsoever. I just spoke in plain English, and this is how far we've come. So I'll do the follow up, and then we'll try to kind of get a look at what that looks like. For me, that's really cool. And I'm going to try to show you what it actually did so you can actually see why I think that there is still a lot more that needs to be done in here. So though you cannot see it too clearly, maybe if I highlight some of these elements, you'll see it. It did change the font to Futura, so it got that right. Obviously, the font is correct, but the color is not correct. And again, I can drag and drop these tiles, but it's obviously still not doing that. So I think there needs to continuously be a lot more back and forth between me and my app, trying to get a little bit more specific. But I don't know. I'm still so impressed by what it actually did. So a lot of the UI elements that it had initially created were good, but they were also kind of just a little bit off. So I decided to try to play around with it a little bit more, and I gave it a couple more instructions. So I said, the tiles are dragged and dropped on the canvas. They should stay on the canvas. The original tiles were not actually staying on the canvas. I also said the tiles should be connectable using a pathway from either of their four corners. So the tiles should have little nodes, and then those nodes connect to each other using some sort of draggable pathway that can be linked to each other. So I wanted to include that. I also asked it to change the text for all the buttons and tiles to a specific value of just black. I also asked it to update the font to Futura. So it then came back to me and it actually started doing a lot of the work. So it actually started off with fixing the nodes on the actual canvas, adding some sort of connection points, which was really great. And then it actually then summarized all the changes that I'd made. It's like, I've done all these things: node persistence, connection of the points, text styling, visual improvements. And then it asked me to obviously like run and see what had happened. So when I did that, the color still seemed really light. And so again, I asked it, can you like make sure that the font or any font that's really used in there is pure black? And so now I'm curious if this actually has happened. And so one of the things that I'm discovering, obviously, through this process is that, it is a lot of trial and error to a certain extent, but it's also a lot of you repeating a lot of the elements that it needs to actually, grasp. And sometimes it's doing it, sometimes it's not. But I think what's really powerful is that, you're getting a lot of quick insight into this actual build process. So after everything that it did, I kind of went back to it and kind of did a little bit back and forth, trying to get it to correct for some of what I'd seen visually that was wrong, right? It kept making some changes, which you can see here. For example, it tells me that I've tried to persist the nodes. It tried to make some changes to the sidebar, and then it tried to make some changes again to the flow editor as well, tried to make the font black like I wanted it. And the first round, it did not do exactly that. Like it actually tried to do it, and then the UI still looked exactly the same. So I actually started to give it a little bit more clearer instructions. In my opinion, I said, is it possible to make the entire toolbar black on the left? Make each draggable tile a high contrast black border. And then I also wanted to toggle for night mode. I just wanted to see what it would do there. And then I submitted that, and now it made a whole bunch of changes, which it's now asking me again to go and look. Right, it shows lighter dark mode. It's made some improvements to the black background for the sidebar. It made some improvements to the node styling. So let's see what it actually did when we kind of go into the actual UI itself, which I think, it's going to actually, hopefully this time around, get it right. And as you can see, it did. So it made the font, which it got correct the first time. There's a better contrast of all of the elements right now. I don't know if they'll actually like fit, but when you actually drag it, you can actually see now it's got the black border, which I asked it to make a high contrast border for. What I'm not seeing now are my tools, which has suddenly gone missing. And I'm also not seeing my toggle for dark and night mode, right? So again, not perfect, but this is pretty cool. So my next round, my next actual test for this entire application as a whole is to actually like take it and maybe go smaller. So not make, this is obviously such a big kind of elaborate ask for it, I feel, in my opinion. The next round, I'm going to take the ask and make it a little bit smaller, where I just ask it to do something simple, like maybe help me code a very basic interaction, maybe for something that I've been doing at work. Like one of the things I notice at work, for example, is sometimes you want to be able to show someone how does the processing button work, and you just don't want to spend the time to go and build that entire prototype in Figma just to show how a processing button functions. Maybe it can help you kind of just demonstrate that, right? Like straight up, that could be a really easy, quick way for you to hand over to your front end dev something that they can then go in and actually look at and say, oh yeah, no, this is doable, this is not doable. I also think if the website was a little bit simpler, it would do better. I also feel like it should draw more from some of the Next.js templates that exist and kind of like pull from there a little bit more. So that could be something that I could ask it to do. And then it could kind of like use those base components and elements to then build it out. But either way, this was a lot of fun experimenting. I honestly feel like I'm eternally thankful to David Andre, whose like video I found randomly online. He was really encouraging everyone to try, and here I've tried it, and I feel genuinely this could work. This could work. There's a lot of promise here. Give it a go. I'll add links below for people to go and take a look and try out things. But have fun with it, and then let's see where we go next.